Okay, we've been talking about race, and in this video we're going to talk about exactly what racial inequality looks like, give some examples of that, and really importantly figure out what it is that we mean by the term racism, and how we can see racism as connected to those racial inequalities that we observe. So let's start then with thinking about race and racism. Race, we've already seen, as a social construction. But that doesn't mean it's not real in a social sense. That is to say, race is not real in nature, but race is very real in our social lives. And it's important to see that its consequences, the consequence of having this particular construct of race, in which African Americans especially are subordinated to whites, and there's a kind of racial hierarchy that we're talking about. That's very real, and it has very real consequences for our world. Race is socially real because we give it a set of meanings that has very real consequences for the daily lives of people in those different racial categories that we have socially produced and constructed over time. So let's take a look and sort of think about what this might mean. I'm going to give you a series of different kinds of racial inequality that we can observe. And so let's start with what I think is the most compelling or notable or dramatic forms of racial inequality that we observe, the racial wealth gap. What you can see here as the median net worth, that's a measure of wealth of households in 2005, just before the financial crisis of 2007 and 8, and 2009 right after it. So we get a kind of snapshot before and after of what racial wealth inequality looked like. And of course you see that everybody's wealth across racial groups goes down across this period, but take a look at these numbers. Let's just take 2009. In 2009, whites, on average, the median net worth, the sort of average white household was at $113,000 of wealth. That same year, the average or median, African American household had about a little over $5,000 of wealth to its name. That is a dramatic gap. And the same disparity is there in 2005 as well. And you can see there's a kind of similar pattern where Hispanics also have very little wealth that tracks roughly what African Americans' wealth is. And Asian Americans have wealth that's a little more similar to that of white Americans. So these are dramatic and I think quite startling wealth inequalities. Let's take a look at another one. Going backwards in time, and this would actually track in the same pattern going all the way back into the 1950s and the start of the tracking of these kinds of numbers. There is a gap in unemployment where African Americans are consistently about twice as likely to be unemployed than are whites. And this ebbs and flows with recessions and with the ups and downs of the economy, but fairly consistently, we can see that African Americans have about double the unemployment rate of whites. Race and incarceration. African Americans are far more likely to be incarcerated, and in various ways, as we'll see, bound up with the criminal justice system. And you can see that this is true going all the way back into the 1930s. But there's a dramatic turning point in the 1970s where the rate of African American incarceration dramatically climbs upward, and this is a moment in time where there's this sort of law and order narrative that emerges politically. This is a part of President Nixon's what's called the Southern strategy to get white Southerners into voting Republican, which they weren't before that. And so this law and order strategy gets translated into an actual law and order implementation, where African Americans get way more likely to be caught up in this law and order trap than are white Americans. There is a notable bump for white Americans, but you can see the inequality is just astronomical during this period. And we can see this as well in other parts of the criminal justice system, where African Americans and Hispanics as well are more likely to have extensive racial profiling or be sort of interacting with and having to engage with police. They're more likely to be ordered out of their car. They're more likely to be frisked. They're more likely to be asked for a consensual search. They're more likely to be forced into a non-consensual search of their property, and they are more likely to be arrested. And so in all of these ways, we can see how it is that there are these various, or the existence of these various forms of inequality. And so what is actually producing this, or how are we supposed to think about these inequalities? And this is where the concept of racism becomes really important. So the consequence of an idea of race and the consequence of a hierarchy in which we hierarchically organize racial groups and create dominant racial groups who subordinate other racial groups, all of the consequence of that is bound up with racism. It stems from the idea of racism, or it stems from the practice of racism. And so we really need to get our heads wrapped around what we mean by that term, because it's quite confusing and there's a lot of slippage, especially across three distinctive types of things that we tend to all lump together as racism. And the first of these we can think about as prejudice, right? So we're going to distinguish actually prejudice from racism. That is to say, you can have racism without prejudice, it turns out. And so prejudice is really about people having attitudes or opinions that are hostile towards some outgroup. And really any group can be prejudiced towards another group. If you have these sort of negative sentiments at the individual level, we can call that prejudice. And so ideas, for example, that black people are lazy, that white people are cold and mean, that Asian people are good at math, all of these really reflect prejudices. Individual level stereotypical assumptions about differences between groups. And we can move now to the next level where we can think about discrimination, right? And really, when we talk about discrimination, we're talking about particular kinds of behaviors to deny members of another group, another racial group, some particularly valued resource. Now, these do not actually have to be a function of your own personal prejudices. This could be, for example, if you're a manager in an organization and managers above you tell you that this African American candidate who you like is really not a good fit for the company. And that could be kind of pushing you into engaging in a discriminatory behavior, even if you don't hold that particular prejudice, right? So, but what's important for you to see here is that discrimination is really about behavior. Refusing to rent out your apartment to African Americans, refusing to hire Hispanics, all of these things could be seen as are a part of what we want to call discrimination because they're linked to behavior. But again, this doesn't have to flow from any prejudices that an individual making that decision may hold. And then finally, we can think about racism, right? And when we think about racism, we have something much bigger, much more institutional in mind, where we're thinking about a variety of different kind of culturally induced actions and practices and institutions that have an effect of reinforcing racial domination. And it's really important to see here that this matters, or that this can happen whether it's intended to produce this effect or not. We can generate institutions that produce racism, that produce actions and practices that reinforce those racial hierarchies and forms of racial domination that really aren't connected to people trying to even do that. And we can all then end up getting bound up within these institutions that produce racial inequalities. Now that's really, can be really difficult for us to see. So let's actually take a look at how it might work. So let's actually, well, let me say first, racism then we should think about as something that's built into the fabric of the institutions of our society. It's not about prejudice. It doesn't have to be connected to prejudice. Certainly, certain forms of prejudice can be racist for sure, but it doesn't have to be a product of individual level prejudice. But what it has to be doing is engaging in reproducing racial inequalities that we've been talking about. So let's see how this might work. Let's go back to that racial wealth gap, that startling inequality that we see, and ask ourselves, why does this thing exist? Why does this gap, this dramatic, this huge, this enormous gap in who gets to own what parts of our society, what resources we have, why does this exist? And this has a very long lineage that's connected to building state policies that actually exclude African Americans from building up wealth, building up those assets that generate wealth for a family. Racism was built into our social policies from the first moment of what we now call African Americans, of black people entering into the United States on slave ships. So it's built, you can see how it's built into slavery. That's not terribly difficult to figure out. But think about this for a moment. In that moment of slavery, what is happening for white families? White families, at least some of them, are able to build up wealth, right, through the institution of slavery, holding slaves themselves, having slave plantations, or in other, even outside of the institution of slavery, they're able to accumulate wealth in other forms of businesses. At the same moment that African Americans are locked out of any wealth building assets or practices, right? So during slavery, whites are accumulating wealth at the same time that blacks are not allowed to accumulate wealth. And then we move into a post-slavery context in which Jim Crow is institutionalized as a means to lock out African Americans from accumulating wealth. Moments of excluding African Americans from more higher paying jobs, oftentimes diverting or ostracizing black businesses, and in things like the Tulsa, Oklahoma race riots, actually destroying the wealth that African Americans were building up. Right? So this is a form, again, of whites being able to, over this period of time, accumulate wealth unimpeded, while black families are unable to secure that same level of wealth for themselves. And then we can move into New Deal policies. Many people don't really recognize that the basic policies of the New Deal that instituted, for example, Social Security, actually locked out African Americans. And they did this in a way that doesn't seem racist now, but was very much intentional at the time. They excluded from things like Social Security. They excluded the jobs that were primarily held by African Americans, farm laborers, and domestic servants. So African American men tended to work on farms, and African American women tended to be domestic servants, and those were explicitly excluded from the Social Security provisions. And even things like the GI Bill were implemented through the states, and states made it very difficult for African Americans coming back from war, from World War II, to utilize the GI Bill, which I should note enabled my own grandfather to go to college and build his own business, which generated wealth for him that he is able to then pass down to his daughter and ultimately spread down to me, right? So this is one of the key things about understanding wealth, is that it produces a cumulative disadvantage, or if you like, for African Americans, while simultaneously creating a cumulative advantage for whites. It is passed on intergenerationally, which generates all kinds of advantages then for the children of those white families who are able to secure wealth for themselves that is locked out for African Americans. And this is really just scratching the surface, I want to say, in terms of how this is this wealth gap is being produced, but it is a critical way to understand the way that our social policies built racism into their fabric, into the institution, which then produced this phenomenal wealth gap that we see to this day. Okay, so let's think then more about race and racism and how racism produces these forms of inequalities, and I'll talk to you guys later.